Hello and welcome to this month's Rochester Xamarin meeting. My name is Andrew Heffling, and thanks for coming. We have a very exciting talk lined up today that we'll get to in just a few minutes. Before we get any further, I want to thank .NET Foundation for sponsoring our user group and the meetup expenses with that, and providing resources by getting us hooked into the community to get more people attending. I think we have some new attendees today that got linked into that network, so it's cool to have them helping us out here. So I want to go over a couple announcements that's happened in the past month. This is just a list of things that I've found and people have submitted to me about the Xamarin community. The Xamarin.Forms 101 is a thing that James Montemagno from Microsoft has started. You head over to the Channel 9 website and search for Xamarin.Forms 101. He's creating a series of videos on the Xamarin Show that kind of talk about the basics of building a Xamarin.Forms application. If you're a C# beginner programmer, you'll still be able to take away stuff from this, even if you're an advanced programmer. I went through all these videos and I thought they were really, really well done, and I was able to pick up a couple nuggets of things I didn't know existed. So check those out, and we'll have links to that in the blog post that goes along with this video. Moving on, Xamarin 3.6 was released this month, and let's go over to GitHub for that. So one of the big things that is in Xamarin 3.6.0 is Xamarin Visual. If you haven't seen it, Microsoft is talking a lot about Visual and what it's going to be able to do for you, where you have shared UI elements. So your buttons, your entries, really anything inside of it are going to end up being more or less the same across your platform. So you have like these custom styles. We'll talk about them in just a minute. But if you head over to GitHub, there you'll see some of the features that are still in preview and a lot of the community contributions that are coming out in the latest releases of Xamarin. The community is really adding a lot of value to the platform right now, fixing issues and adding new features out there. And it's an exciting time to be a part of the community. There is this wonderful blog post by Microsoft about Xamarin.Forms 3.6 and Visual, as it's now generally available. It's no longer an experimental feature. And again, it's really nice on how you can get very similar look and feel with not much work between iOS and Android. And with Xamarin Visual, one of the things that they released is material design as a default styling. So you can go and download 3.6 and use it in your app and say, I want to use material design, and you're going to have material design on both iOS and Android, which is pretty cool that they included that right out of the box. Or you can go and create your own style. Just lost my screen. There we go. So you can also head over to the docs. Again, I'm going to put all these links in the blog that goes along with this. But one of the things that I wanted to highlight with this is David Ortano of Microsoft came up with this visual challenge. And if you head over to his GitHub repository, basically he wants you to fork his repository and spend an hour, no more than an hour, he said, and go through and try and use Visual with this and see what you run into. Maybe you couldn't finish it. He wants your feedback. Maybe you made a really awesome screen. Again, he wants your feedback, and he wants you to submit a pull request. So if we head over to all the pull requests here, there's all sorts of people that are completing his challenge. And one of the things about this challenge is, if you follow David or James Montemagno from Microsoft on Twitter, they recently came into a lot of Xamarin swags with the new Xamagon stickers and a couple other things. And they announced at the .NET stand-up last week that if you complete David's visual challenge by the end of this month, so by the end of March, you will get a free bag of Xamarin swag sent to you. And I believe they said that was including international people. So if you're outside the United States, you could still get a free bag of swag of Xamarin stuff. So head over to his GitHub, check out the visual challenge, and submit a pull request to see how it is. They're definitely looking for feedback, and the people over at Xamarin have been doing lots of community engagement, trying to figure out what's working well, what's not working well, what do they need to work on to make the platform better for everyone. If you haven't heard, I'll scroll up to the top here. The .NET Foundation has opened their membership to anyone that participates in a .NET Foundation project. The membership is still open, and if you haven't applied and you participate in any .NET Foundation project, you should really apply. And the other thing with that is they have open board positions and elections that are coming up. And right now, there are a lot of people that are running for a board position right now. Many MVPs are in that list, and they're all trying to make the .NET community better for everyone that's involved. So check that out if you're a member, and start looking at who you might be interested in voting for if you are not a member. I really encourage you to apply for membership. Last time I talked with John Galloway from Microsoft, who's been coordinating the membership effort. The membership is still open. It is not too late to apply. It is not too late to run for a board position, because all that stuff is still open. And even if you haven't submitted a code contribution, doesn't mean you can't run for a position or be a part of the .NET Foundation. So they're really looking to get a diverse set of people together to run the board and be a part of the membership. It's another .NET Foundation page. If you haven't heard, there's this new thing that's been circulating Twitter called the 10 Days of Xamarin. And it is another thing like the Xamarin 101 we were talking about a few minutes ago. And you basically sign up and they give you different Xamarin projects to complete. And it starts out with very basic, I'm a new programmer, I want to learn Xamarin. And every day they give you a new challenge. I came across this one, and I really like the concept to make it easier to learn Xamarin. And so check that one out. And the last community news that I wanted to share was there has been an effort that to add new APIs to the collection of T in observable collection. I saw a tweet from Chase a couple weeks ago about this, and Microsoft approved new APIs for add range, insert range, remove range, and replace range. And I started a pull request that is in the works right now, that we're getting reviews from community members and Microsoft that we're hoping to get completed soon, so next week or so. But one of the things that was really exciting at the bottom of this issue, it was noted that it's going to be a candidate for the .NET Standard, which is really important for anyone that does Xamarin work, because how many times are you working in a view model and you got a list of data that you want to plug into an observable collection in a list view, and you got to go and add each one individually whenever you update it. It's a lot of extra code that you don't necessarily need to write, and now it's going to be built right into the standard, which is exciting. And I believe it's going to be available in .NET Core 3.0 and .NET Standard 2.1, but that's not official yet, or once we get the pull request submitted there. All right, let's go back to my slide deck. And there we go. All right. So let's talk about today's speaker. Dylan is here to talk to us about Rider and Xamarin tooling. Dylan is also Dylan, you're the founder of the Toronto group, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
All right. Well, and I'll give you that shout out. Dylan is the founder of our Big Brother, Big Sister group, as I'm calling it, because they're helping us out a lot of the Toronto .NET mobile developers. They're providing a lot of help with us as we get the Rochester Xamarin user group started and being on a consistent basis. So Dylan's speaking this month, and we have other Toronto mobile .NET developer group members that are already approached me about speaking in the future. So without anything else, I'm going to send the screen over to Dylan and let you get started on your presentation.
Awesome.
We'll make you presenter. There you go.
All right, I just gotta get my deck ready here. Just give me 1 second. All right. Okay, you see my screen?
Yes, I can see it.
All right, okay, so today gonna talk about a pretty high level, kind of a pseudo technical topic where we're talking about some meta work. We often there's lots you see out there around code when it comes to building Xamarin apps, and this is one of the areas that kind of tends to fall through the cracks. I'm not sure why, because there's a lot of things out there that can really help. I said in the description the whole thing around the old adage of a poor carpenter blames their tools is it's so irrelevant for our profession and the time we live in, because if you think about what we do as developers, we build tools for business users to do their job more effectively. It doesn't make sense not to pay really close attention to your own tool chain so we can actually build software more effectively. So that's what this is kind of all stemming from. We're going to have a specific focus on Rider. I use Rider a lot. I'd say 90% of my development these days is in Rider, and I build apps all day. So let's get into that a little bit. So who am I? I'm a consultant at BSI Labs. BSI Labs specializes in Azure-based mobile apps. So we do a lot of work with Azure, a lot of work with Xamarin, other mobile frameworks, native, completely pure native. So we're kind of across the board around mobile development. I personally specialize in Xamarin.Forms. That's my area of expertise. I've been working with Xamarin.Forms pretty much since right before it went 1.0, and I've been working with it and building apps with it since. And yeah, so that's my area. I've been developing at a professional level for 18 plus years. So that means I've been getting paid for it for about 18 years now, a little over 18 years actually, if you add it all up. And I've been with C# almost since the very beginning. So since it went into, since Visual Studio, the original Visual Studio.NET went RTM, went gold, I was using it. So if you want to get a hold of me, I just recently revived my domain and I've started blogging. My first blog entry is kind of related to this tooling. My About Me page has all my social media links. And of course, as Andrew alluded to, the TO Mobile Devs site, which I also just stood up over the last week. If you really want to see what a mobile developer thinks of a good website looks like, I really suggest taking a look at that link.
So you can't say your website's not good.
Oh, you should see it. Hold on, I'll load it up.
See it. Yeah, bring it up. I want to see this.
It's bare bones, does not really adequately describe what I have put together here. This is me with 10 minutes and time boxing it to 10 minutes. Here you go. It's good, right?
I do not see it.
Right?
Oh, there it is. Oh, wow, that is good.
As bare bones as we could get. That's basically what we're going for. I wanted one simple link that we could point everybody in our community to go, here's how you connect with us. Go to tomobiledevs.com, and then this is really how you connect, because really what are we going to do as a user group having a website? Really, it's just connect everybody to where we're actually going to be reaching out. So yeah, it's a good website for a mobile developer. I'd say it's probably one of the best websites a mobile developer has ever created.
We'll talk offline about that.
Yeah, I kid. Again, time boxed. So Rochester and Toronto are really close together. We're 153 kilometers apart, and really, if we're talking Imperial, which Andrew, you'll be more familiar with Imperial. That's about 95 miles. It's actually a little less. I've got it kind of pseudo downtown. If you measured like edge to edge, it's even less than that. So it's like it's a very short distance apart, but it's like about a 3.5 hour drive and a border crossing. So, it seems like it's something like, oh, you just hop in the car and you drive for a little over an hour and you're there. No, it's not quite the case. It's like a 7 hour kind of ordeal. And I included a photo of the Rochester garbage plate. And Andrew, you want to comment on that?
That's one of my
Yes.
favorite delicacies. It is so good.
Nice. It reminds me of a poutine.
Really, that's I will have to share that with my wife later. She'll get a kick out of that.
I've never eaten it, so I can't,
Oh,
just by the looks of it and what I know about it.
it's just it looks really gross, but it's a filling meal. It's got 2 cheeseburgers, home fries, mac salads, meat sauce on top. It's like a smoothie. It's a burger smoothie.
Yeah, yeah. It's like Soylent. It's
Yeah.
your complete meal solution. All right, so let's get into today's topic, talking about development tools. So before we can start talking about development tools, have to be able to talk about operating systems. So I know as .NET developers, a lot of us come from the Windows side, and I want to address this because the landscape has really shifted, and I still see a lot of people kind of clinging to Windows when it might not be the wisest choice. So Windows has been the home of .NET since 2001 when Visual Studio .NET came out in beta. It's great for Android now. It was not even great for Android previously unless you went through the process. If you had an Intel processor and went through the process of setting up the Xamarin emulators, it was decent for Android. But really, that wasn't everybody. That didn't apply to everybody. Xamarin was like, it had a lot of involved setup. So the barrier for adoption was high. Getting people up and running with a good Xamarin setup in Windows even was a little tricky. It was likely their comfort zone, so they had their productivity tools, they had Visual Studio and all the tools that they're used to dealing with. But as soon as you started trying to get connected into a Mac agent to get an iOS build going, that's when things start getting a little rocky. So I know I felt this pain. I used to primarily target Android when I first started, and it took me about a year to go, okay, I've had enough of this. I'm going to try using a Mac. And I switched over and I haven't really looked back. I actually think for those Xamarin developers out there that haven't switched to dealing with Mac full time, I think it's worth a really serious look because I'll talk about kind of the trade-offs here. So
Is
talk
it okay
about
if we
Mac.
interrupt you with questions?
Yeah, sure, please do.
So I have a question for you.
Yeah,
I still develop on a Windows machine. I love developing on a Windows machine because I like Visual Studio and I like a lot of the features that come with that. And I'm not not Xamarin. Visual Studio for Mac just doesn't have some of the hotkeys and features that I'm used to in Visual Studio. So what I end up
yeah,
doing is and I actually have the setup right in front of me right now. I have my MacBook Pro over here. When I do iOS development, I push my code up to my branch and I download it over there and I do everything on my Mac. And then when I do Android development, I do everything on my Windows machine.
yeah. Lots of people do similar things. That's the way I function for the first year.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll come back to that. So
Okay.
I've got some stuff. So talking about Mac, like first of all, you talk about the Apple tax, right? It's expensive. So you're paying more for the same hardware, essentially the same hardware as you would with a Windows machine, but you've got, the Appleisms and Apple tax associated with it. That's a barrier. And it's not supported by all enterprises. You go to work for a big organization, sometimes trying to get a Mac is going to take a lot of work and be a bit of a headache. So that's a problem as well, presents a barrier. Of course, we got the dongles. I know for me, I've got an older MacBook. I've got a 2005, a mid 2005 model. So that was the last model they produced that wasn't exclusively USB-C. So I've got the MagSafe and USB-A and HDMI and, like ports that are useful to plug things into. And you'll have to tear that from my my cold dead hands, because I don't want to deal with the dongles. And I really hope the next update will have, you know, a dedicated power port and maybe some sort of display port instead of relying on the USB-C and the dongles. And what I find for Mac OS, and this is the Android point, is not as much a concern anymore since Microsoft has done so much for the Android experience on Windows, but it's great for both iOS and Android development. You can really quickly get things up and running on iOS and Android. And for Forms developers in particular, it becomes this is where things become really key. Of course, there's another barrier around most .NET developers haven't had an experience or a lot of experience with Mac. They live their day-to-day lives on Windows. So like Andrew, I think this applies directly to you. That's where I came from too. I had never used a Mac full-time. I rarely used a Mac to begin with. And switching, it was cumbersome. And it took me a while to get as fast as at all the tasks as I am in Windows. But now it's like, that's history, ancient history. So really it comes down to how fast can you cycle on Mac and get those changes really tested and pushed to a device and tested. It's always going to be faster to work with the iOS sim, even if you're working with an optimized Android emulator or a physical Android device. The sim is always going to be faster. The iOS sim is my route choice for testing. Like I said, I'm a Xamarin.Forms developer. So for me, if I build a UI and I test that on the iOS sim, there's probably a 99% chance that's going to look the exact and perform the exact same on Android. Of course, there are cases where it doesn't, but I usually build for iOS. I target the simulator. I cycle really fast. There's some tools that help me cycle even faster that have really come to the forefront over the last little while. And then I test it on Android. And I test it on Android just within Mac OS, and I usually test on a physical device because Android's a whole other beast. So that's kind of my flow, and that's where I started with this. Is I'd moved from Windows to Mac, and I found myself in the position where I was moving back and forth quite a bit. And I'm actually going to talk about where I came from and how I evolved. So we've got operating systems out of the way. We've kind of talked about the pros and cons with using each operating system to develop Xamarin apps. Now let's talk about IDEs. So IDEs, of course, we'll start with everybody's workhorse or the .NET community's general workhorse, which is Visual Studio 2017 and soon to come 2019. I won't touch 2019 because I'm paranoid. I've been burned by new IDEs too many times that I'm very cautious. So 2017, of course, it's a great IDE. It's the tool of choice for .NET developers, has Xamarin tooling baked in. There's great analysis and there's some analysis and refactoring tools. In my opinion, they tend to be lacking. There tends to be gaps. There's things you can't do. There's things that don't really work the way you want them to. There's some frustrations. And when you're dealing with a big code base, that becomes pretty important. Those automatic suggestions, it gives you the ability to really like pick up large chunks of code and move them or restructure them or any of that kind of thing. That's really, really important. So particularly when you're dealing with like a mobile app that maybe shares components between a backend and maybe an Azure function, or there's libraries that are kind of spread throughout. When you want to refactor things, it becomes pretty key to have those tools be top notch. So the last thing, I already alluded to this, but it's cumbersome for iOS development. So you either have to deal with making your Visual Studio 2017 instance talk to a Mac agent, which has all the same tooling or all the Visual Studio for Mac tooling installed and with versions that match what you have. You have to upgrade them together in sync, or you have to do what you said earlier, Andrew, of pulling the changes on your Mac and then separately testing them there. I don't like either of those flows, to be quite frank, and it tends to be like clunky. It's cumbersome, it's clunky. Even best case scenario, when you're dealing with Visual Studio 2017 to develop on iOS is not ideal. If you're if you're uh, if you're building actual storyboards and for iOS, I would say that trying to use Visual Studio 2017 for that, or even Visual Studio for Mac, you're using the wrong tool. You're going to need to use Xcode. So people who are doing native development, storyboards are pretty much, you build your storyboard, you build your UI with Xcode, and you write your backend code. So you write all your C# for your controller in Visual Studio. So again, you can't really do that with you can't run Xcode on a Windows machine. So you're kind of stuck. The other thing I want to talk about is ReSharper. So Andrew, you were talking about this before. I am a die-hard ReSharper user. ReSharper has definitively helped me become a better C# coder. Really has. It's just what it is. It gives you suggestions, it gives you insights, it exposes you to language features that you might not have noticed before, or maybe you learned them and forgot them, and it suggests them at good times. There's all kinds of things built in. The refactoring tools are absolutely top-notch. You can move things around, rearrange them. It's excellent at that. So not only does it help you write code and write better code, it helps you manage that code once it's already written. So when you're in maintenance mode, it helps you with that. It also helps you with all kinds of styling tips and tricks, and it's all customizable. It's, to me, trying to work without ReSharper is basically you're doing yourself a disservice, because this tool is going to help you. It's like you're almost like paired programming with the IDE itself. It gives you that much help actively as you're working with it. So that's my take on ReSharper. I know that doesn't quite jive with your point of view, Andrew, but that's my take on it. I am insistent that if you do have the opportunity to work with ReSharper and really get to know and love it, that it's very useful. That being said, there are some downsides. Andrew, you touched on this too. ReSharper's really heavy. It's really heavy. It'll weigh down your IDE. It'll make solutions load slower. It'll make certain operations take way longer. So what you get back from the IDE being able to help you write and manage code, you lose in performance. So there's a bit of a trade-off there. Now, I'll get to how we can potentially solve that. But for now, I'm going to show how I manage this. So I work with a Mac full time. You can't, as a .NET developer at this point, you can't abandon Windows and Visual Studio. You can't. There's no option to do that. You have to have a mechanism where you can access a Windows machine. So what I do, is I use Parallels. So Parallels is basically it's a VM host, so I can run Windows on my Mac. So like I said, I've got an older 2015 15-inch MacBook Pro. It's a quad-core i7. So if I need to, I can give Windows 2 cores and fire it up. I can give it a good chunk of memory. I think I give it 8 gigs. And I have a full-blown Windows implementation, Windows machine that I can use if I need it. And sometimes I do. Sometimes I do need a Windows machine if I'm dealing with any .NET Framework projects, if I'm dealing with some Azure-specific things. Sometimes the tooling's just a little bit better on Visual Studio. So really, you want to have this available. I run ReSharper. And Visual Studio. I still need it. For managing a large code base, it's hard not to have it. As soon as I remove ReSharper, it feels like now all this work that I've had ReSharper helping me do automatically is now manual, and I'm having to, copy and paste code and bring in references manually and all kinds of things. Visual Studio helps me a little bit now, and they're continuously working on adding refactoring tools, but it still feels like I'm operating with two left hands if I'm not working with ReSharper. So this is my Windows machine. I don't even think I'm really going to demo much here because I don't think there's really much to say. It's a Windows machine. Everybody knows how to work with Visual Studio on Windows, and you'll see that it takes probably a little longer because I'm both running on a VM and running ReSharper. That loading solutions and things like that are not as snappy as it would be on a Windows machine, like a native Windows machine. But I spend I'd say less than 2% of my time working with Visual Studio for Windows. I'm rarely in there. Let's see, it's coming up. ReSharper gives you all kinds of great things. There's still live share if I want to do live share from here. So there's great tools available with Visual Studio for Windows that I still have access to, which is great. So I don't have to turn my back on Windows. I can still continue to use Windows to get my job done. It's still a necessary tool. None of this is replacement. It's all additive. That's the thing that I'm really trying to go for. Is there's many tools out there. Make sure you understand your options and know which tool is going to be right for the job. Because at this point, it's like having a toolbox full of tools, and you have to know when to use a screwdriver versus when to use a crescent wrench. Like I think, in my opinion, it's becoming more and more specific where I use various IDEs. So here's something that's really interesting. This is exactly one of the problems that we see with trying to develop for Mac or for iOS on a PC. I've got a version mismatch. So I went and did some updates, and sure enough, it doesn't align. So this just underscores some of the problems with trying to develop for iOS on the PC. So if I'm using a dumb build agent that I don't want to have to physically have a secondary computer, like maybe I've got a Mac Mini parked in the corner or something. Actually, speaking of, I have a Mac Mini that was parked in the corner, and this used to be what we built on. And this is long retired Mac Mini, which now just collects dust.
But I have the same problem, Dylan.
Yeah. So now, yeah, and it's slow, and you get these version mismatches all the time if you update out of band. And sometimes we'd be collaborating on a project, and it wouldn't be well communicated that somebody was going to update, and somebody would go and update the Mac and update their machine, and I'd go to build, and I'd go, what? I have to update my Visual Studio now, and you have to wait for 3 gigs to download because the installer is so big for Visual Studio for Windows and the whole thing. So Visual Studio for Windows doesn't go away, but I'm not going to use it to do iOS development ever. I'm going to never, ever use it for iOS development. I'm going to use it for the cases where I have no option but to use Visual Studio for Windows. That's where I'm at now with my IDE selection. So unless I need to do something specific for .NET Framework, I don't use Visual Studio for Windows. And that's that. All right, I'm going to park this VM.
Yeah, I had a problem with my Mac Mini. It stopped working because it was just too old and couldn't get the latest versions about a year and a half ago. And it's like, well, I guess I really actually need to buy a Mac.
I found it, like I said, I worked with one for a year. I found it so annoying to deal with it in that respect. Even if I was doing what you were doing, like going and pulling the code. I was actually, this was 3.5 years ago. We were using, we weren't using a Git repo. We were using Visual Studio Online, as it was called at the time. Now Azure DevOps, Visual Studio Online with Team Foundation version control, which isn't very well supported on Mac. And there was all kinds of challenges.
Yeah, the problem I ran into was, and I see this all the time, is everyone's like, well, let's just get a Mac Mini and have all of our developers connect to it. There's And I've seen a couple of companies in town here where they have like a farm of like 20 of these Mac Minis because they don't want the developers having an actual Mac machine. And
Yeah,
it's
it's
I'm not a big fan of the Mac agents, and they do their job very well. They spend a lot of time and money fixing it, but to me, there's nothing beats actually just downloading the code on a Mac and then running it in Visual Studio
yeah,
for Mac.
even better. Just develop it with Visual Studio
Right.
for Mac, and that's where I'm at. So I spend a fair bit of time using Visual Studio for Mac. I find Visual Studio for Mac is um, really good for some things. It's not necessarily your. I talked about ReSharper kind of being your paired programming partner through the IDE. I'm going to kind of play off this theme. Visual Studio for Mac is if you had a paired programmer, if you're doing paired programming, and the person who you're working with is very drunk. Like I'm talking, they've been on a bender for weeks. That's Visual Studio for Mac. Uh, you really are lacking a lot of analysis and refactoring tools. The text editor has been ridiculously buggy in the last like 3 or 4 releases to the point where it's bordering on unusable at times. And so those are some challenges. So I don't usually write a lot of code using Visual Studio for Mac. And I'll get to what I usually use it for. There's some great community extensions for that. I'll go over that. I'll demo some of those. I'm hoping it improves with Visual Studio 2019 for Mac. I installed it today. Daniel's been running it for a while and has given me good feedback. He says it doesn't blow anything up. So that's usually, I let somebody else be the canary in the coal mine. I'm not going to play that role. I need to be, when I have time to write code, I want to be immediately productive. I want to sit down and be able to tear through some code. So Miguel tweeted out a couple days ago, last week, I guess, that the Visual Studio for Mac 2019 comes with a new editor. So it's a new editor engine and using the same editor engine from Visual Studio for Windows. So you should get all the same refactorings, plus it's using, like you said, the proper NS views, so the proper underlying UI controls to actually make it work properly. So I'm hopeful for 2019. I don't have enough hands-on experience to actually comment on it, but I'm very hopeful that it'll actually be a really solid choice. So if you're already using Visual Studio, don't want to pay for another license, you can just grab Visual Studio from Mac and it'll get the job done. Because like I said, 27 or Visual Studio for Mac, the current version of Visual Studio for Mac, it's had some issues. And both these run side by side, so you can actually run Visual Studio for Mac with Visual Studio 2019 for Mac. So let's demo some of this. So I am going to bring in, we'll start with Visual Studio for Mac. I really want to cover, Visual Studio for Mac has one really main use case for me, and that's debugging. So Visual Studio for Mac is still, in my opinion, the absolute best for debugging mobile solutions. So it has, just has a really good, simple debugging experience. There's not a lot of bells and whistles. You still have your staples. You have an immediate window, you have your watch window, you have locals, you can set conditional breakpoints, like all the tools you'd expect, which is great. And it just does the job really well. It reliably will start the apps. You have like a nice simple launch menu up here. It just works well. I'm a fan. So most of the time I use Visual Studio for Mac for debugging, but there's 2 other things where I like to use it. The first is an addition to debugging. It's if I'm actually doing UI design. So I have two extensions that I'm going to talk about. The first one I'm going to talk about here is Live XAML. So Live XAML, if you haven't seen it before, is gives you a mechanism to be able to update XAML and have those changes immediately reflected on the phone or simulator. So if you're actually working on like just pure UI design, you're not working on how things are functioning, Live XAML takes your loop from being a launch the app, get to the screen, oh, it doesn't work well, stop the app, make your change, launch the app, wait for it to deploy, get to the screen, look at it again, to a make the change, see it reflected immediately.
Dylan, I got a couple questions on that, if I can interrupt you real quick.
Yeah, please.
So Live XAML, is that a free extension or is that a paid extension?
It is paid.
Okay.
So
I just wanted to clarify that for anyone that's watching, that it is paid. That is a really valuable extension that I love. I personally don't use it because, well, my business is a little bit smaller than yours. But can you explain a little bit more about how that works?
yeah, I'll go as far as to demo it because I
Oh, you're
want
gonna
to.
demo it? Perfect.
Yeah, I want to show how that
I just want
works.
to make sure that everyone that's here and anyone that's watching the video really understands why Live XAML and Live Reload is so important to developing apps.
Yeah. So first I'll do a run through of the traditional flow. So let's launch my app. So this is a little app that Daniel and I collaborated on to build for our Toronto user group. It's not live in the store or anything, but it's just a little fun thing we use to test out some of the new changes, some new UI capabilities, things like that. So pretty simple. We've got, a couple tabs on the bottom and some nice font icons, nothing big. So what if I want to make a change here? So I've got this upcoming meetings. Let's say I just wanted to say meetings. So what do? So traditionally I stop the app. So the app's no longer running on my sim, no longer running. I go into my page. So let's go into, I think that's, I don't even know what it's called off the top of my head. I think that is meetings list. Meetings list, upcoming meetings. Okay, so let's change this, save it, and I'll redeploy. And I'm waiting, it has to build it, it has to redeploy, it has to launch it. And I'm doing it on the top level screen. So for me, it's just going to be right there. But usually that's not the case. Usually you're working on complex apps and you're several screens deep, and it might have a login. There might be all kinds of things involved. So there's my updated meetings. And again, that was really easy. So this actually, I think this app has Live XAML installed. And if it doesn't, we'll just add it in here. It does not. So let's add that in.
So Live XAML is you're going to need to include that as part of your app to do the live reload, correct?
Yeah. So
Okay.
it's two pieces. It's an extension for Visual Studio for Mac, and then you include a package in your kind of your core library where your XAML lives.
So how does that work when you need to go to production? I'm sure anyone that's done enterprise development is probably scratching their head saying, my corporate lawyers are not going to let me ship an app with something, this package in there if it's not actually being used.
Yeah, you can bundle that out. It's easy to put a declaration in your CS project to say, if you're building in release, don't include this binary. And it doesn't have any hard dependencies, like you don't have to actually do anything in code. It's all kind of hands-off, automatic. So you can just have it not be included in a release build.
All
I
right,
think
cool.
even at this point, I think it actually, there's some features that it has in there. Yes, okay, so here's the other thing. If you put a compilation symbol, and I'll show quickly how to do that. there's some compilation symbols that basically keeps all this code out of production. So there's, in the live XAML assembly, they've got pre-compiler directives defined that look for this compiler symbol. So if I go into my production or my release configuration, and I add in this disable Xamarin.Forms live, none of that code is included at this point. So
now that
basically,
disables Xamarin.Forms live, that's a directive that they have written into their app code.
yeah.
Okay.
So that's already there, and then as soon as you include it as a symbol in your release mode, it links it away. But you can even go higher up than that, right? So if it becomes something where it's been flagged as an issue and you don't even want to include that assembly in release builds, you can also have it so your project configuration doesn't even include that package as a dependency in your release configuration. I'm not going to get into the logistics of that, mostly because I'd have to look up most of the information because I haven't done that in a while, but you can have, based on the build definition, you can selectively include a assembly as a dependency.
Yeah,
Cool.
I pasted the package inclusion on the chat. It's pretty simple.
Cool.
But Dylan, don't let us derail you too much. I'm just asking the questions that I'm
No, that's
hoping
good.
some YouTube video watcher would have, so they don't need
Yeah, exactly.
Like,
No,
hey,
that's
how does this work? Let's do this work.
that's not a derail. So that's perfect. That's the exact kind of real life question that needs to be fielded, right? So yeah, keep them coming.
All right, good.
Okay, let's go with this scenario. So we've got it meetings. Now we're going to put it back to upcoming meetings and see it refresh in real time. Now this particular app might give me some headaches because this particular app is relatively complex on the UI side. We're using some bells and whistles to take care of this. So we'll see how it goes. As we wait for it to build and launch. Okay, so it says meetings. Now we want to update it to upcoming. So the app's still running. Come to my page, save the change. You can see that it's communicating here with Xamarin Live or Live XAML. And there it is. So upcoming meetings, it updates the text. So I'll actually do that with both items on screen. One thing you'll want to know about Mac OS if you start using it, for those who don't use it day to day, window management, not quite the same as Windows. So yeah, I can say, having an extra quote doesn't help. Hello, Rochester, and away we go. So it adds that element of speed and like really reducing cycles of having to reload and relaunch. So from my perspective, this product is $200 USD. I know that per year, I think, is it per year or lifetime? I can't remember yes, so you can buy permanent license for $240 US. So if I use this for a year and it saves me even just, an hour a day when I'm working on UI, it's gonna really pay for itself several times over. So I see this as a big productivity tool and a big productivity enhancement. Same thing with mFractor. I'm not going to get into mFractor as much mostly because I just renewed my license before we started and I haven't brought the license in. But mFractor gives you all kinds of tools, all kinds of basically IntelliSense and refactoring tips and tricks, all those kind of intelligent editor components, brings it to the XAML editor. So as I'm working on my XAML, it'll even work with Prism and tell me this looks like it should be binding to this view model if you're using the standard convention, and it will tell you, you know, you have a problem. Actually, I think this is mfractor right here. So it's telling me that, hey, this doesn't resolve to something in the binding context. Did you mean event list? Refresh context, refresh command that event list. Actually, that's what I'm using. So I don't know, maybe there's a little bug. My mfractor is out of date and I don't have an up-to-date license with it either. So that's on me for not having that ready to demo.
Well, I got
But
a
that's,
nice curveball for you.
yeah, sure.
So you showed us updating the label, and you said, "Hello, Rochester, upcoming meetings," and all that stuff, and it updated in on the app. So that's live reload. That's really cool stuff.
Yeah.
What if I asked you to add another label or an entry or another any control?
Oh, sure.
Will that update? I would assume it would.
Yeah, absolutely.
The whole
Like you
process
can
of
do
live
all
reload.
kinds of, yeah, that was the hello world binding. So this is,
Right.
or a hello world example, but you can get really fancy with this. Like,
Okay, cool.
so you can make all kinds of changes on the fly. It's good and continues to improve at how much complexity it'll handle when you're making changes to this on the fly. So I'm very, very impressed with this tool, particularly when you're doing complex UI changes. You have no idea how much time and frustration it'll save you. To me, this goes from, you can take a screen development, like if you're building a complex screen, you can cut it in like less than half in a lot of cases because you're cycling so much faster. You can actually just see the changes being made as you're saving it. So yeah, very, very valuable tool in my opinion. All
Well, that's great.
right.
Thanks for showing us that's impressive what it can do.
Yeah, it's a good one. I really like that tool. And I have a solution loaded here that I shouldn't have loaded. So this is Visual Studio 2019. I'm just showing that it can run side by side. That's all I really want to demonstrate here. So if you want to try out the new tooling, it's available. Again, I haven't used it in anger, like I haven't used it day to day, so I have no idea what its faults and promises are. I just know that Miguel says the text editor is better, and that can't be a bad thing because it needed a better text editor. All right, any other questions on VS for Mac and some of those plugins that I ran through? No, good.
I'm not seeing anything in the chat, so go ahead and continue.
Good stuff. All right, so next up, so this is the meat of the presentation really. So we talked about Visual Studio and ReSharper. Visual Studio and ReSharper together had all the refactoring tools that we're talking about. So what's happened is JetBrains, the company that makes ReSharper, is also the same company that builds IntelliJ and WebStorm and RubyMine, and they've got all kinds of different applications that all use this IntelliJ shell, which is also Android Studio, by the way. Android Studio is just a rebranded JetBrains IntelliJ. They licensed that to Google for Android Studio. So it's the same shell, which means you have a mature IDE shell that functions across multiple languages already. And what they've done is they've tailored it to C#. So they've basically taken that engine from, or the shell from IntelliJ, and they've taken the engine from ReSharper along with Rosalind and all that great stuff. So they've taken their .NET components and C# components and their IntelliJ components and married them together, getting a nice cross-platform browser that they've called Rider. I've been using Rider for, I'd have to go back and take a look at when I angrily tweeted at them. So I think it was just shortly after Build last year. So last year, as at Microsoft Build, I ran into the JetBrains team and I said, your product doesn't work with Xamarin. What's the deal? And they said it should work, which is the typical developer catchphrase. It should work. Oh, that should work. And it turns out that there was a couple of bugs and those had to get worked out, but they've been worked out for a while now. So I've been using it for almost a year and I'm super impressed with it, and it continues to evolve. They're fixing things and continuously improving it. It's a great IDE and a great tool, and it tends to be the best of both worlds. So I get the same power I got from the Visual Studio 2017 and ReSharper tooling. So I get that power, but with the speed of Visual Studio for Mac. So Visual Studio for Mac I used almost exclusively before a Rider became a viable option, and I loved Visual Studio for Mac's speed, and I loved how the debugging experience worked. It was really great. But anytime I had to do any large refactorings, I would do the opposite of what you do, Andrew. I would push my changes all up to the server. I'd commit everything, push it to my Git repo, and then I would go over to I'd spin up my Windows VM, and I'd pull it down on my Windows VM, and I'd use ReSharper and Visual Studio to do the refactoring, because the tooling there was so much better to move around and maintain large code bases and do any of that kind of heavy refactoring work. With Rider, you get the best of both worlds. So you get those same capabilities that come with ReSharper, like basically all of them. I think there was one that I found that doesn't exist, one refactoring that doesn't exist in Rider that exists in ReSharper. It probably just isn't exposed, but remains in the engine. So you get all the power of ReSharper, but with all of the speed of like a really lightweight IDE like Visual Studio for Mac or VS Code. So to me, it's the IDE of choice. Again, this is something you have to pay for, so there's a license associated with it. But for me, this is, if I want to be a productive developer, I'm a consultant. So when I charge work to a client, they need to know that I'm working at my absolute highest ability. This tool gives me the ability to crank out way more code and do all kinds of complex refactorings and build good unit tests way faster than the other two tools that we've just discussed. Faster than Visual Studio 2017 with ReSharper. Really, it's three tools: Visual Studio for Windows and ReSharper, Visual Studio for Windows, ReSharper, and Visual Studio for Mac. So those three, I don't really use those anymore unless I have to. So like I said, my use case for Visual Studio 2017 now is only if I have to deal with something that demands Visual Studio 2017. So that's something like .NET Framework or something maybe Azure database related that I can't do with any other IDE.
Bill, I want to interrupt you again, just for
Please.
people that are curious about the pricing model. I'm not going to ask you because I actually just looked it up. For somebody like me as an individual developer, I can go and buy a monthly subscription to this for $13.90 US a month, which is very competitive in my opinion for me to, let's say I pick up a Xamarin project, a small one that I know I'm going to get done in 3 months. Well, I can go and try Rider out for that entire project lifecycle without a huge commitment. Or I
Yeah,
can do the yearly pricing model, which starts at $139 US. And I find that really, really competitive. It really has all of those features in it, and I'm excited to
yeah,
see what you can show. But I want to share the pricing with everyone that's watching and listening along.
awesome. That's great. I'm actually writing those down. Part of this. Awesome. Okay, so yeah, you get code analysis, refactoring, and extended IntelliSense, code styling and formatting, and tons of other stuff that I'm going to demo as much as possible. All right, so let's get to the demo. All right, so first I'm going to start off with, let's get this out of the way. I'm going to start off with how do you get it? So my recommendation is don't download JetBrains directly, or sorry, don't download Rider directly. Download the JetBrains toolbox and let it manage your tools for you. So you can see here, there's actually an update. I'm glad I didn't see that earlier today. I probably would have been tempted to hit the update button. So it takes care of notifying you when there's updates. It'll update Android Studio if you're using Android Studio, which you can see I am. If you're using any other JetBrains tools, so you've got all their different tools here, it'll take care of updating those things for you. You can run several on the Mac, at least. You can run versions side by side. I'm not sure what the experience is for this for Windows. That's another thing I really should be mentioning here is Rider is a cross-platform IDE. So even if you're like, no, I am a Windows user, I'm never going to use a Mac, you could try Rider on your PC. There's a good trial period too, Andrew, isn't there? For I think it's 30 days or 45 days.
Let me interrupt you in 5 minutes. I'll go look it
It's
up.
30 days. I got it right in front of me here. So
Oh,
yeah,
perfect.
you can try it.
Never mind.
Yeah, you can try it free for 30 days. So you could run it for 30 days free to try it on Mac or Windows or maybe both and figure out what you want out of the product. But either way, it's the
Doesn't Rider also support Linux?
yes.
So
Yeah, I don't.
I've read a little bit about Rider about the time you started using it last year, and one of the things that was compelling to me was I can use Rider on my Ubuntu machine to use Xamarin Android, even though Xamarin Android on Linux is not officially supported.
Right.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Do you know
Cross-platform,
anyone
right?
that's doing that?
I don't. I don't know anybody who uses Linux on a day-to-day basis except for on the server. So almost everybody I talk to is either a Mac user or a Windows user day-to-day. That's interesting, though. It is interesting having that option available. I know sometimes when I start playing around with my Raspberry Pi, I just noticed that kind of in a similar vein that a couple of people on Twitter were commenting on getting Visual Studio Code running on their Linux boxes, and I'm like, I did that years ago with Visual Studio Code on a Raspberry Pi, which was a bit of a fun project. Had to build all the binaries from source and all that kind of stuff, which was fun. But that's a separate thing altogether. So JetBrains Rider. JetBrains Rider is my daily driver. This is where I spend most of my time as far as IDE goes. And why am I launched? So this supports multiple versions in line. I'm actually on an older version. It doesn't really matter for the purposes of this demo. We'll go through this. So yeah, one thing to note here is with Visual Studio for Mac, when you're managing multiple solutions, it's kind of awkward. So if I have Meetup app here and I want to load up, like I've got another app here. Let's go load up my HTTP tracer library. So let's bring this in. I'm basically stuck loading one solution at a time. Or if I really want to, I can open up a second solution in the same workspace, which has its own issues associated with it. I gotta sort
So did we
this.
hear you right? Did you say that in Writer you can open up 2 solutions at once?
Multiple solutions, as many as you
Oh, I'm
want.
sorry, more, yeah, more than one. So if I had, let's say, a mobile project and a .NET Core Web API project, and they were in separate solutions and separate repositories for code organization, I could load both of those up in the same instance of Writer.
It's separate instances, so that's the difference. So
Okay.
here, I can load up my Meetup app, and I just made the same mistake twice. Actually, this is third time's a charm here. So if I actually, if I want to load up 2 solutions in the official way in Visual Studio for Mac, this is how I have to do it. I have to click the solution, I have to make sure the options are expanded, and I have to uncheck close current workspace and click open. And that'll bring both solutions into my Solution Explorer. So I don't have separate instances, but I have one instance of Visual Studio for Mac, which is I'm using to open both, which is, it's cumbersome. I don't like it. I'm not a fan of how this works. For a long time, I was using an unofficial mechanism called Visual Studio Launcher, where Visual Studio Launcher will open a second instance. You'll see one come up in a second here. Any second. So then I can actually have 2 instances running, but it's buggy, particularly in the latest versions of Visual Studio for Mac. It's not meant to be run this way. So it's meant to be run with 2 solutions opened in one instance of Visual Studio. So that was a frustration for me, for sure. I know it is likely a frustration for other devs, just trying to get 2 solutions loaded. It seems like a reasonable use case. Writer does that. Just, you don't have to do anything special. It actually prompts you. So if I open up my Meetup app in this IDE, I feel like everything is lagging right now.
Yeah, GoToMeeting really drains your screen share.
Yeah, I've got
Whenever I use GoToMeeting, I'm always like 5 seconds behind.
I am going to quit a bunch of things just really quickly. Mostly Visual Studio for Mac instances.
Are you using Monkey Cache in this project?
I am.
You got to be with barrel.db.
Yeah, that's spoiler. I didn't close that down for when I was prepping for the demo.
Oh.
Yeah. So we'll get to that. Okay, so I wanted to run through. So you get some good like the intelligence baked into the code editor gives you that. It feels like you're pairing with somebody. Like it's good enough that to the point where it's giving you good suggestions, it's correcting spelling, it's like looking for mistakes, it's proactively giving you suggestions. Like it's fantastic. It's a really, really great editor. It gives you all kinds of collapsible mechanisms like you're used to with Visual Studio. It looks and feels like a very mature IDE because it is a very mature IDE. Writer is a new product, but the actual IDE shell has been around a long time, and it's heavily battle tested being part of Android Studio, because any Android developer doing native Android development is likely going to use Android Studio, and it's essentially the same shell. So there's all kinds of great features built in around that kind of thing. You can tell it's giving me, look, I've got some feedback right here. It's going, this is in a CS proj. So this is in my actual project file going, what do you need this for? This is one thing I want to actually call out. So when you add a page using Rider, it will include some metadata in your CS project file that is noise. And this is one of the things, it's just one small thing that they're probably going to fix because there's an open bug for it, where I pay attention to. I will always go, so I added test page, and it's added this item group, this useless metadata into the project file, which is totally unnecessary. So before I went and committed this, I would just remove it from the source here.
We're talking about a lot of different IDEs here. What IDE is that bug in?
That's in Rider. So I'm from here on out, I will not talk about any other IDEs. I'm going to talk about Rider exclusively.
Okay, because I've seen that issue in Visual Studio for Mac, older versions, which has been fixed in the newer versions as well.
Yeah, it's long gone now for VS for Mac. So you've got all kinds of great tools. You've got, like, you know, stuff that you're used to in a rich IDE, like multi-line selection by holding down your Alt key. It'll highlight your matching brace on tags. It'll look for all kinds of great suggestions to give you. Let's see. So here, what do I have here? So here, this is like kind of the heartbeat of your code quality, is up in your file. It gives you this inspection. So it tells you, it's saying here, I've got one warning and one inspection. So let's actually go down to where that inspection is. So it's actually telling me here that, hey, look, we already know, because you've got a partial app, that it's a Prism application, because in your XAML file, it's already defined as a Prism application. So the other part of the class that's generated is already defining it as a Prism application. So you don't need to define it manually here. So it's telling me I can remove this because it's a redundancy. So if I either click the tool type or tooltip, or I can just hit Alt Enter using my tool map and hit Enter again, and it'll fix it and implement that refactoring. So I've got another one. Let's see.
Is that a setting that you can adjust from the Rider configurations?
Is that a which you can
Is that a
adjust?
setting that can be controlled? So let's say you're working on a team that says, I know it's a partial class, I know it doesn't have to be there, but we want to make sure that it's there so anyone that's in here understands where this class inherits from.
Yeah. So if you want to be explicit with it, so you can say, so now you have these options. You can disable it with a comment. So I could say disable with a comment, and it tells ReSharper, don't give me a suggestion on this.
Right.
You can say disable this inspection in the configuration. So actually configure the inspection to don't show, be a hint, be a suggestion. Here's a warning. It's a redundancy. It's treated as a warning. But I could say, I don't want this. Don't warn me of this. Get rid of this. This inheritance redundancy is noise to me, and I don't care about it. Personally, I like it. I think it's good being aware of, maybe not in this case. Maybe in this case you'd want it to be explicit, but maybe in other cases. So maybe in this case I'd want to do it with a comment. So disable it with a comment. So that I think that'd probably be a good case, because in other classes you probably wouldn't want to have this disabled if you were creating noise by, implementing an interface on a base class and then implementing that same interface on a superclass from that, or a subclass, I should say.
Cool. That's really cool. You can do that right from there. Right, wrong, or indifferent. It's nice to have the flexibility to do that right there.
Yeah, it's flexible. So if I wanted to, here's another nice thing. So as soon as I make this change here, so I'm going to remove this redundant base type reference, because we already know it's a Prism application because it's defined in our XAML. It's going to give me another warning immediately. So as soon as that happens, I no longer need the new the namespace that I brought in with the using. So this Prism Autofac is now redundant as well, and I can get rid of that. So then I get a nice green check saying that everything's good. So Andrew, you expressed some resharper frustrations. Some of the resharper suggestions used to be very aggressive. That's changed quite a bit recently. So now, not recently, it's been over the last couple of years, they've gotten less aggressive, and things that would turn your code yellow before will now not turn, they took a bunch of things that were treated as warnings and moved them into suggestions. So it became like more of an opt-in than a flag that something was actually wrong. So I like this green check. It gives me a good sign that, you know, this matches our coding standards. You can change the way Rider and ReSharper evaluate your code on a project by project basis. You can also have it respect editor config. So if you've got certain standards, it'll adhere to that. So this is project by project basis. It's really, really flexible what you can do with it. So I know you've got some, you're a little jaded with your ReSharper experience, but I would encourage you to try it again and try the tooling again and get used to how it works and get used to that flexibility, because I think you do yourself a bit of a potential disservice by looking at it as something that's hindering rather than helping. It's just, you got to figure out where that balance is and how to tweak that so, you know, people understand that the green check is an imperative, or if they are treating it like that, then you adjust your rules. So it has the flexibility to do all that flexible configuration to make sure it's not going to be heavy-handed. So that's we've got some suggestions and fixes. It also does a solution-wide analysis. So I can bring that up. So it gives me like a bird's eye view of where it has errors and suggestions. So I can go through and I can look at some of its noise, right? Like cannot resolve symbol system, like what are you talking about? Actually, this is UWP, so that does make sense. So I should actually, so this is a shortcoming, right? So UWP can't build UWP in Mac. So if I was working heavily in UWP, I'd be working Windows. I don't use UWP. I rarely build for UWP or target that platform. So for me, it's not a thing. I know there's lots of people out there who are targeting UWP. If you're targeting UWP, you're going to have to use Visual Studio for Windows. That's your only option. Or Rider for Windows. That's also
so Rider for Windows will work for UWP applications.
100%, because it's the dependencies, right? So it's not necessarily the IDE, it's the dependencies for actually being able to build the project.
Okay, so you know, with Xamarin.Forms, we're not building just iOS and Android apps all the time. What about Rider for Mac OS? Would that works? Okay, cool.
Yeah, you're good for that.
You just got to be on the right operating system, obviously.
You have to be on the right operating system, yeah, so you can build and have the right dependencies and everything like that. So yeah, you get a bird's eye view of your different solution issues. This is telling me again, I'm behind a couple versions, and XAML editing in here is still, it's good. It gives you some IntelliSense and some good suggestions. It's not perfect. It's still improving. So that's yet to come.
So if you compared it to the IntelliSense available in Visual Studio on Windows for XAML, what would you say Rider is better or Visual Studio on Windows is better?
I would probably lean towards Rider at this point.
Okay, I got a couple questions for you then.
Let's see.
So let's say you're developing this page here, and so you already got these styles set up. So like, let's say we wanted to add another setter under your label icon style, right?
Yeah.
And you know, one of the great IntelliSense features that came out, I forgot exactly when it came out, but IntelliSense for the property. So we did like setter space property equals what is that, label? So you should have like font color or color in there. And if you started typing it, it would just show up. Oh yeah, it's all right there. That's great. Okay,
all
cool.
there, yeah.
Okay, cool.
Plus you get you get other tips too, right? So it's context aware, kind of like Mfactor is. So it'll
Right.
tell you, it'll try and figure out what your view model is and tell you what bindings you have available. It'll
Okay.
also do spell check, which is
Oh, that's
huge,
great.
just out of the box, right? And it's good. It works very well.
Okay, so you said it does binding stuff. So you got a binding down there at line 26. So if you deleted label
Ah,
text in there and you started typing in, it would like Prism. When I do bindings with Prism in Visual Studio and Windows, and I never get IntelliSense
yeah,
because of the way that uh, the view model is binding to the view. But if you declare the view model binding inside the XAML, I found out recently that
yeah.
IntelliSense works. Is that something that works with Prism here?
It won't work in this context in particular because this is a control. So it
Okay.
doesn't actually have a binding context till runtime. Like
Okay.
it doesn't even have an inferred binding context.
Oh, that's
With
right. It
something
is
like,
control.
yeah, something like a content with header, content page, something like this. So this is actually where it's used. Something like this, I can't quite recall, Andrew. I'd have to experiment with it, and I don't feel like mucking around too
Oh
heavily
no,
with that.
no. Feel free to tell me to shut up.
But no, no, no.
I'm feeling on
I
you.
think that's a good point, and I can't quite recall how it works
Okay.
on
Yeah, and I'm
actually
just
sensing your binding, like how unless you have it like actually declared that like, hey, here's my um, content page, content view dot. Is it? I can't remember the syntax for actually declaring the binding in XAML.
it's weird. And this one you got your local
There's
base page, so you'd have to do like local base page dot
Well, you can
binding
still do content
context.
page, but yeah,
Right.
the binding context, like whether you're setting it, you can set binding context really in two ways. You can do the binding context, the XAML binding context, where I actually give it a binding context, or you can do the compiled binding hint. And I can't remember how it works with either scenario. When you define your binding context in XAML, I know it picks it up.
Right. That was
Um,
kind of the question I
yeah.
was going at there. And I'm just trying to think of the different use cases that I would personally like to see for IntelliSense in a XAML page when I'm editing. And
Yeah.
you showed me one of the big ones, which was a big headache, was having the IntelliSense for when you're doing your property definitions for your styles. Another big
Mhm.
one is binding IntelliSense and control IntelliSense. And if it's got those
Yeah.
three things for me, I'm pretty happy.
Binding IntelliSense, Mfactor is the best for that.
Okay.
Mfactor runs circles around anything else. As far as controls and things like that, like this is a great solution to actually get your XAML syntax in there. So that's good. It'll really help you with the properties and things like that. I want to move on to some navigation things. So one thing that always drives me nuts in Visual Studio for Mac is the search. The search is horribly slow and just bad. So the search in Rider is, there we go, something already relevant, is super fast. Like you just saw, I just hit the hotkey and it's already got the last result up and away I go. Social finds everything. I could even do like an S. Oh, it doesn't know camel case. But find is super fast. It's real time. It gives you results. It gives you a preview window. I've got this enlarged really large because I've been working on a very big monitor. But it doesn't take up the full screen necessarily. It usually comes like this big.
Yeah, I like it being that big. I can actually see it.
Yeah, it's great. It's like the search is much better than Visual Studio for Windows 2, in
So
my
can you go
opinion.
in there and like edit those code snippets
I
below?
can.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's
it's
so
really
cool.
helpful. Yeah. So if you're doing something like maybe you want to do a search and replace, uh, but it's like a selective search and replace, so where you can't use the built-in search and replace. This is like a great tool for that, where you could just dip in and I could say, oh, after the social icon, this context, I need to do I don't know, put in whatever, blah. foo bar, right? So yeah, you've got a code editor right here too, which is excellent. Very, very helpful, very useful utility. The other find utility you have is accessible with Command T. This is the search everywhere functionality, which this does use camel case. So if I go like social icon SI, it'll find social icon as one of my top results. It's really, really good, really, really fast. I can search for method names, load events feed, and navigate right to that. It's excellent. The search everywhere or navigate everywhere is excellent. You can also bring that up with shift. So it's really quick to dive into that and start navigating your code. One of the things that is lacking, and kind of bothers me, is the visual class and method navigator that you usually find at the very top of your code window in Visual Studio for Mac or Visual Studio for Windows. I like being able to selectively browse that, but when that's not available, like this is pretty great. Another thing that's available through here is it actually has a decompiler built right in. So if I wanted to look at, a lot of this stuff is open source, but let's look at the monkey cache barrel. So I just command clicked on that. It's navigating to the decompiler. So it actually has decompiled the assembly so I can browse through it and figure out what's going on. So if I'm using, I used to be a SharePoint developer back in the day, and I remember this was a absolutely critical thing as a SharePoint developer. You had to go and pick through the assemblies to figure out what was going on, because sometimes there'd be some crazy logic that you'd had to reverse engineer to figure out what was going on with the system. Why was it behaving this way?
So with this, Dylan, can you set a breakpoint inside here and have it?
No.
No. Okay. That was,
No,
I
you can't.
remember that was a big feature in some of the decompilers I used back in the day, where I could actually set a breakpoint and decompile code and step through it.
No, you're not gonna, like, maybe you can. Maybe.
That's my biggest curveball. Sorry.
Yeah, let's try, man. So let's run this. This is a good question, because maybe you can. So I should walk through the deployment flow really quickly here. So I'm set for debug iOS iPhone simulator. I've got my iOS defaults, but I'm not defaulted in my configurations here. I'm not actually set up to use a specific device. So it's prompting me. I'm just gonna let it prompt me. So you can see you get the selection screen at this point. It's a little bit different than with Visual Studio, where you'd select that ahead of time and then hit play, hit your F5. So I'm gonna go XS Max, launch it. Let's see if it hits my constructor breakpoint. Does this have multiple constructors? Nope.
Because if that works, you might have sold me.
Just having the decompiler built right into the IDE to me is a pretty big win.
Oh, that's huge.
And I know, like, most of the stuff we deal with now is open source, and you can use the what's it called, where you can navigate directly to the open source and it'll pull down the code for you. That's new in Visual Studio.
Yeah, but it's nice to be able just to click decompile and go and take a look at the actual function that's being called from your
yeah, absolutely.
code context. And that's, you can't put a price on that. That's great.
Oh.
Well, while we're waiting for that to go, Dylan, I was talking with Daniel in the chat, and I think I'm going to give myself a challenge to use Rider on my next project. I'm really liking what I see. You might have just converted me in this presentation.
Cool. You can join the club. You can share your findings with Daniel, Chase, and myself. We've been using it pretty much full time for about a year.
We'll have to do a little roundtable with everyone later this year.
Yeah.
Feedback on. I think that'd be fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see. Running. Didn't hit that breakpoint. You can't set a breakpoint on the decompiled code, but like well, you can, it just won't hit it. But you
All
can't
right.
decompile the code. Okay, so I want to go through a couple things really quickly. Number one, the debugger. I think I told you I'm not a huge fan of the debugging experience here. It's okay. It still uses LiveXAML. It'll still connect through LiveXAML. You can see it's actually launched the, oh no, sorry, it failed to find the handshake server. So you actually have to use LiveXAML through VS for Mac. So my debugging preference is VS for Mac because you have to use, if you want to use LiveXAML, you have to use VS for Mac. The other thing is there's no immediate window. So there's actually, if you care to chime in, I will send a link. Actually, I'm going to ask Daniel too. Daniel, can you find the link for the immediate window in the resharper, or sorry, in the rider issue log, so we can send that out as a link? Yeah, it should be somewhere on their site. So there's a bunch of people, I think there's like 250 people who have asked for the immediate window experience to be added into rider. I know that's something that frustrates me. The other thing that I don't like is something that some people would like. When you're executing a Lambda, like say if I've got a complex Lambda expression, it will break on every piece of that Lambda, and to me that it's not a great experience. It's just kind of irritating. There's a few things, not big things, but just small preferences to me that Visual Studio for Mac is still my home if I'm doing a lot of heavy debugging. So if I need to work on UI, if I need to if I'm doing a fair bit of debugging, Visual Studio for Mac is my tool of choice. If I'm doing basic debugging and writing code, Rider is my tool of choice. Unit testing, I'm just going to say, I'm not going to demo anything here. I'm just going to say the unit testing experience in Rider is absolutely fantastic. The way it handles, the way it finds unit tests, the way you can group them into sets, like it's really, really good at unit tests, at dealing with unit tests. There's version control baked in, so it's got Git functionality built in and Team Foundation version control. I don't necessarily like that. I've taken to a lot of command line version control tools, but it does give you some nice indicators. Like it's told me that this blue highlight here shows me that it's changed, and I need to commit. It hasn't been committed yet. So simple things like that, it's good. The one thing I really wanted, I want to touch on two more things, or really three more things here. I want to touch on databases of SQL, and that was some spoiler. You saw the barrel database up there. So this app uses just basic caching. So it uses caching on that list, that event list that you see come up when we launch the event. Oh, it's already running. You can actually run multiple instances of the things through Rider too. So this list here is cached. This comes back from our service, and actually we just ask Meetup for it for the RSS content, and we parse it out and cache it. So that's, oh, thanks, Daniel. So I should close Slack. I lost my train of thought completely. Was I talking about database experience there?
Yeah, databases and how the app pulls the RSS feed into Monkey Cache.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, really simple. Like that's what the app does. If you want to inspect, like if you're using SQLite, there's SQLite tooling built right in. So you can go, you can open from path, data source from path. I'm just going to open up what I have this do, just so you see the little trick I'm doing here, is when my app launches, I just dump the personal path to my debug window. So if I scroll up, the database path gets dumped here. And from there, because I'm running on the simulator, I'm actually running on the same piece of hardware. So it's actually on the Mac file system, so I can load up the that's another thing that's big with running on the sim, because the sim's actually just like a little slice of your actual Mac. It's not running in a VM. All of its files are on the file system. So if you're writing to the file system in your app or writing to a database on the file system or any database, it's available. You can reach in and start modifying it. So I'm actually looking at the database right now for my app that is running in the simulator. So I can actually start browsing through the tables that are part of that running app, and I can actually see what's in there. So I can actually go, I'm not actually super familiar with this. Chase uses this all the time. I don't. I tend to be a little old school. Well, not old school, but I use a separate utility. I don't know why, just because I guess I haven't carved a path, or maybe it's because of this. A little error. So, well, just disregard that. Just pretend it loaded great.
Looks like it loaded to me.
One sec. Yeah, look at the path again. Daniel's reminded me that the path might have changed. So maybe I'll do that. How do I close this one? Disconnect. Remove. This is really not what I'd want to be doing ideally. I actually even made sure I had the right path on a clipboard and everything. Doesn't look like anything's changed. Oh yeah, it has changed. Okay, give me a sec.
Yeah. If it was launched in a different simulator, then the database is in a completely different path.
Yeah. So there we go. I use that too. So I get my data sources and drivers. I can test my connection. So that's just, I pulled this and then I looked at I just browsed through the file system to see where it was. So you can actually see, this is the nice thing about running this stuff on a Mac, right? Go to this. When I get that raw link or what I dump to the output window there, it gives me this path. So this is my Sims file storage, and I can start expanding it out. Library caches, monkey cache, barrel DB. So that's just a nice little tip. That's a big perk of using the sim. So then I can go okay and bring it up. And it takes a minute to load here. And then I can browse. So that's what we put in the cache. So it's coming from this URL. And here's the serialized data that I saved to cache when I loaded the app.
That's fancy.
Yeah, it's cool. So if you're dealing with a complex app that's using SQLite to do either caching or offline capability or whatever it may be, you can dig right into that at runtime. So like I'm in the database that is running on my sim right now. So I could change values, like say I'm dealing with a RO app. So this is just cache. But if I'm dealing with something that's saving some complex data structures down, I could hit save, then I could look at what data was saved to the database just to make sure it was what I expected. So that is super useful. And having it built into the IDE is really nice, not having to bounce around with tools. And again, I'm a bad Rider user because I'm not really using this to its full extent. I might though. I still find I use a separate utility. It's still a little slicker. It just is a little simple, little simplified experience compared to this. What else do we got here? So databases. Oh, I wanted to talk about two other things. So let's talk about NuGet packages. So here's another thing. And I'd missed this kind of earlier. I'm glad I've got it in my section of notes here. NuGet, managing NuGet from Visual Studio for Mac is not good. There's no consolidation mechanism. Maybe there is in 2019. But in Visual Studio for Windows, I'm just going to flip back to this and unpause it so we can talk about going to the solution, managing NuGet packages on the solution level, and being able to consolidate packages and versions across. The ability to do that is huge. This is such a time saver. I don't have to individually remember and manage each project in my solution to get the packages all aligned. Visual Studio for Mac doesn't have anything like that. It's frustrating. Rider has some decent package management. I'm not so crazy about the experience. It tends to be a little slow. Like you can see, it's still turning. It's a little clunky. It's just not exactly perfect, but it does work. I'm going to use it right now to update my HTTP tracer, a library that Daniel and I have built and are plugging. I'll show you why I'm plugging that up right now. So I'm going to update that or upgrade it to the latest version 1.0.3. So we'll bring that in. I'm going to relaunch the app with that new package. So once this is done, so it's just restoring packages now. And good, successfully installed. It's doing a bunch of things. Good for it. Okay, so I'm going to get this out of the way. I'm going to stop. And I'm going to relaunch. So the reason why I want to do this is because this HTTP tracer actually leads into the next thing I want to show. I'm actually going to go into the options here. That's annoying how that comes up. So I can tell this to always launch on a specific SIM. So let's always launch on the XS Max. Apply. Okay. Launch this again. So the nice thing that's built into this is it has a REST client built right in. So Andrew, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the REST client extension for VS Code. It's a great one. Are you using that?
You're talking about the REST client extension that's built into VS Code, right?
Not built in, it's a separate extension.
Well, that's what I mean, like you download it and it's like a first class citizen on the extent of the editor. Yeah, I've used that before.
Cool.
I'm always jumping around from PowerShell, Bash, that. I still use Postman from time to time. Whatever I can get my hands on the quickest.
So get your hands on the quickest. Let's talk about that. So, okay, we're about to launch this. I'm just going to move this out of the way so we can see this launching. Has it launched? Did it launch? Okay, it launched. Let's go to the debug. So I've got HTTP tracer wired up here. This didn't work the way I expected it to. Hold on. Oh no, it's still building. So this is still a stale copy of it. So once it deploys, we should get some output here. So we've got HTTP tracer loaded into our as a delegating handler on our HTTP client. So what that does is it basically dumps our requests and responses to the output window. So if we watch the debug output, if it ever launches.
This is free, the HTTP tracer handler.
Yeah, so HTTP tracer is it's a free library that Daniel and I open sourced. We did it as part of the group. It's now part of BSI Labs. We've made it a BSI Labs officially managed library. And I'll show you what it does here. So it will, dump content from your HTTP request. I really should have tested this more ahead of time, clearly. It's supposed to dump content from your request into the debug window. Clearly, I have to refine this demo a little bit because this was supposed to be the really magical part. So it's supposed to dump some HTTP content that shows your request. Daniel's got something for me, one sec.
Well, what you could do to easily fix that is just delete the app off your simulator and then redeploy, and that way your database would be gone and anything that was cached would be gone that showed post request.
Yeah, I believe it's because Monkey Cache is not reaching out to the internet.
Oh,
It identifies that you have the data already cached and just
no,
uses the local data, I think.
no, that's not the deal here. No, because we actually manually we manually serialize things to the barrel. We're not using the HTTP caching features of Monkey Cache. Yeah, it should be reaching out and it should be giving us a response here. Clearly, we've got something to look into.
I'll let you post screenshots on the YouTube video.
Yeah, exactly.
I'll hold you to it. Fix so you can fix it
Let's see.
later. And,
Pulling to refresh is supposed to do the same thing here. Let's see. Let's actually put a breakpoint here. Here it goes. Daniel, see? It's trying to reach out. It's not doing it.
maybe you had a bug in your library there.
We clearly do. All right. So
Because that made the request there.
yeah. Oops. Unless it's logging to the console, which it's not. No. Okay. So demo gone wrong. But what it should be doing is dumping to the console or dumping to our debug output a request that's formatted properly for the HTTP client. So then you could just copy paste it into an HTTP file and execute it. So you can execute HTTP client requests right from Rider itself. So I can run this right here. Of course, it's not going to work because I don't have anything running on 8080, but I can run it and get a response right in my IDE, which is great. It's
That's really
akin
cool.
to the
I really like
REST
that.
client. Yeah, it's nice.
I really like that. I like that. I believe you when you say it prints out to the console. I think it's a great debugger tool. I mean, I know we didn't see it here, but the fact that you can track your HTTP calls inside of your output log there, and then I can copy those and throw them into that REST API HTTP file and test them again. That's
modify something with the URL or whatever you want, right?
Right. I mean, to me, that's the same thing, like same benefit of something like live reload, but I can now go and test my API instead of my UI. I could test the backend very easily without, messing around with my mobile app. I could just go straight to the source.
Yeah, exactly. And I really wish this demo would have worked. It's really unfortunate that it did not. This was supposed to be the magical conclusion, but yeah, I'll refine this. Yeah, so there's just a couple other things. There's a bunch of plugins available. Preferences here, you can get all kinds of different plugins for it. I'm not going to cover any of that, but there's lots available and more coming. Some of them are agnostic to the IDE, so it'll work with any JetBrains IDE. So there's a lot of stuff in here, like there's a Dart one, there's better Git stuff, there's stuff for TeamCity. I've got a whole whack of them installed, like I've got an Azure Toolkit, JSON parser, Android support. So these are the two that I've installed. These are all the ones that are bundled with it. Comes with a bunch of this stuff. So lots of different stuff in the ecosystem. You could even build one if you felt so inclined. It's got a nice presentation mode, which I'll just quickly shift into. So one-click presentation mode where it gets rid of all distractions, enlarges your font, all that good stuff. You can have it switch theme when you switch into presentation mode as well. And yeah, overall, just like a really solid IDE that'll really help with productivity. So tons of features, tons going on in the product, really useful overall. And like I said, it's been my daily driver for about a year and will continue to be. Yeah.
All right. Well, that was fantastic. Thanks, Dylan, for coming here to give that presentation. That's deserve a little round of applause.
Thanks.
I'm impressed. I'm gonna take screen back unless you got anything else you want to show.
Well, let's just first of all, thanks to you for setting this up. It's great to be involved in another forum and get more involved with the community. It's a great community. It's great for me to have a venue to try out some of this stuff, like some different topics and things like that. So that's cool. BSL Labs, of course, because they basically facilitate a lot of this stuff. Chase and Daniel, who I've been working with for a little over a year, both of them, and we've all been sharing ideas and things that we've seen around Rider, and like that we built some open source projects and things like that. And then I had a bonus slide, so like I wasn't sure how time was going to go, but maybe this is just a topic for another time. So I think with everything said and done, just leave this one aside as a teaser for next time.
So I'm going to put you down for May or June to do part 2 of this then.
Sounds good.
All right. Oh, well, I'll talk with you about getting some dates on that later, but I'd love to have you do another follow-up. Any IDE discussion in class, you know, when I was in college and I was just learning Visual Studio, one of the things we said is you could take a 10 or 16 week class on IDEs and still not know everything in the IDE. There's just so so much power and so many tools to be more productive and everything. I think you gave a very good overview of a lot of the features here. And I was talking in the chat and said, I think for my next Xamarin project, I am going to try Rider and see how it goes.
Great.
And I would love to have an open discussion with you and Daniel and Chase and anyone else that wants to about my experience with it as somebody that prefers Visual Studio on Windows.
Yeah, that's great.
And let me take a screen back. And where is it? And we'll go back to presentation mode. Yeah, and the other thing that was mentioned in the chat, maybe we should ask Rider if they would sponsor this effort. As Daniel was mentioning, they should sponsor this presentation from the beginning. But we'll have a fun conversation with them about that maybe. It seems like they might as well. I mean, you came in here and said, Rider, everything is JetBrains. I love it.
I'm a big believer in their products, right? So it's not there's no sponsorship or anything. It's just they really help me do my job better. So I'm pretty big on throwing their name around.
All right. Well, again, thanks for doing the presentation. Their technology is impressive, and I'm personally going to give it a try for my next Xamarin project and see how it goes.
Fantastic. Yeah.
And that's all for this month. And we hope to see everyone next month. It's going to be April 10th at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time.